Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Emily Timty and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. During today's presentation, attendees will be in listen-only mode. If you experience technical problems, please use the questions pane of the GoToWebinar control panel. I'll be monitoring that area, especially during the start of the presentation today. You may also use the questions pane at any time during today's presentation to ask questions you
Oh, hello, Emily. I think you fell off. Oh, sorry. You just suddenly stopped.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, there you go.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. Hopefully I don't cut out again. And Brady, please let me know if I do. So if you missed that, kind of in a nutshell, we'll be monitoring the questions pane in the GoToWebinar panel if you guys have any questions. So please jump in there. So we are pleased to have Brady Phillips with us today. Brady Phillips is a public affairs specialist at NOAA's Office of Communications headquarters in Washington, D.C. He works collaboratively with staff to communicate about NOAA's climate science and services and to enhance relationships and communications with key media and stakeholders. He also served in the NOAA Office of the Undersecretary as the Program Coordination Office Liaison to the National Ocean Service. Prior to working at NOAA headquarters, he worked for more than 17 years with NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, working on the diversity of jobs related to coastal and ocean resource management on the West Coast and the Pacific Islands. Brady earned a Bachelor of Science degree in zoology and environmental studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a Master of Science degree in marine resource management from Oregon State University. All right, thanks, Brady. So whenever you're ready.
All right, thanks, Emily. I think you're all muted, but I guess I'm going to assume everybody can hear me and view the slides. So if you can't, type a message in the chat box and let one of us know. Again, so thank you for having me, I guess, present about communicating NOAA's science service and stewardship to the nation. This is kind of a redo of a presentation I gave to the climate board, and I think Fiona Horsfall heard it there and suggested that I do it to the broader, many of you out in the field and the climate focal points and others who might be tuned in. So I've kind of modified it a little bit, and I know just with the change of administration and stuff, you know, a lot of people were asking questions about what can we or what should we or what, you know, how should we be talking about climate? So I just kind of want to go over a few things related to that. Hang on, let me. So what I hope to cover in the next roughly 30 to 40 minutes are just kind of a brief review over the Department of Commerce and NOAA's policy for science communication in general. You know, reaffirming NOAA's business as usual approach to communicating about our science and, you know, our climate science. Going over some key climate resources that you can should have at hand or at least have access to, and then just go over a few best practices, kind of a brief introduction to NOAA's Office of Communications, and then a few best practices for communicating about science, mainly to media, but the you know, it works well with stakeholders and others as well. So the first thing I'm going to say, and also I think after this call, they will send out a link to the presentation, so you will be able to get it in its entirety. Also, I did include several attachments that will also be included in the email that goes out, and one of those includes a little packet on two things. One of them is the Departmental Administrative Order 219-1, which is called Public Communications. And the other one is the NOAA Administrative Order 202-735D on scientific integrity. So again, these are the bulwarks of our kind of what, you know, to reaffirm NOAA's commitment to, as a science agency, to having our science being able to be open and free and to the public and have our scientists talk about their science both to their professional communities and to the public. So I'm going to first start out just with the science or the public communication. So this is our long-standing departmental administrative order, and it is a policy for employees who are engaging in public communications. And by that, It includes publications, speeches, things on the website, and media. And many of these are kind of geared toward the research community, but many of you are meteorologists or work in the Weather Service, so that is science. And the products and services that you are deriving are included under the communicating science policy as well. So again, it explicitly allows researchers and scientists to publicly discuss the results of their research in science or engineering without approval from NOAA Comms or the department. And that includes, and I'll get into this a little more, but you are not, if you get contacted by the media, you do not have to go through NOAA Public Affairs to talk to them. You're encouraged to, and we'll go over some of the tips of dealing with media. Just, it's never good to be cold called by the media and be put on the spot and unprepared. That's how people say things that they don't really intend to say, and it gets quoted and all over the news. But again, this is, reaffirming our scientists' ability to communicate their science. Public Affairs is really here to help you, but, we're not here to constrain or interfere with your basic conclusions of your own science or information either. Again, it does encourage people to, but does not require researchers to use NOAA Comms to facilitate media interviews. And again, I know many people out in the field, if you've worked with a reporter, they can call you directly. Sometimes they go through us out of courtesy. Sometimes they do, they don't. But we'll get into that a little bit more in the tips. Again, actually, let me just reverse a second. So it does require all NOAA staff to work through NOAA Comms for official communications intended for news media, so things like news releases, if you're holding a press conference or a media interview, but it does not apply to fundamental research communication. So let's say you publish a paper in a journal, we do not have to go through our office to publish those materials. However, if you are working with our staff to publish or to do a media release, then you do. And then the one area where you are not authorized to really talk about unless so designated by our office is related to policy, budget, or management. And particularly in these times for budget or pending legislation, particularly if it's draft, it is not appropriate for people to be talking about a proposed budget or a proposed piece of legislation without going through our office first. I mean, even on proposed budget right now, all are being forwarded to the Department of Commerce just because it's so preliminary. The department is handling that for all of NOAA, and it's not appropriate for people way down in the lines to really talk about budget matters. So the companion policy, a slightly newer one, is the NOAA Scientific Integrity Policy. Again, when the attachments come out, you'll have a packet of information that includes the exact text of the administrative order, NOAA procedural handbook that was prepared to help implement it, and then another one just related to what fundamental research communications are and related to the review and approval of that. And that's more of the fundamental, if you're publishing a paper or say a NOAA technical memorandum or something like that. Again, so the scientific integrity policy does apply to all NOAA employees, both political and career, as well as those people that we fund, so contractors, partners, cooperative institutes, et cetera, when they're engaged in communicating about information resulting from these scientific activities. Again, this NOAA Scientific Integrity Policy, it reconfirms that NOAA scientists may freely speak to the media and the public about scientific and technical matters based on their official work, including scientific and technical ideas, approaches, findings, and conclusions. And it does clarify that NOAA scientists are free to present their own viewpoints, for example, about policy or management matters. based on their professional experience, but in doing so, they must make it clear that they're presenting their individual opinion and not the views of DOC or NOAA. And again, so just as an example, if somebody's been a climate scientist for 30 years and somebody asks them to comment on, maybe it was a paper that was recently published that is within their area of expertise, they could feel free to comment. But if it wasn't, directly related to the agency, they would have to give the, make it clear that it's representing their personal views and not the agency. So the other things that the scientific integrity policy and administrative order has done is that, it's kind of guaranteeing the free flow of information. It encourages NOAA to continue and NOAA scientists to continue to to basically provide publications of their data and results. It encourages people to communicate the results both with the media and the public. And in no circumstances does it state that a NOAA official can ask or direct a federal scientist or NOAA employee to suppress or alter their scientific findings. Again, the policy is really there to ensure the free flow of information and maintaining the integrity and traceability of the data. If you dig into the scientific integrity policy, it also relates to, it goes into more detail about other aspects of science, such as putting forth best practices, conflict of interest, and kind of defining a lot of those things. But just for today's talk on communications, I'm only talking about it as it affects, and reaffirms our ability of our scientists to talk about their findings. There is a lot more information available and a separate presentation. So NOAA's scientific integrity main person is Cynthia Decker and works out of the OAR Research Council. And so at the bottom of this slide, you can see if you Google NOAA scientific integrity, you get to the Scientific Integrity Commons, which is a website that holds all this information and where you can go. And I believe each line office does have a scientific integrity person who's responsible for that in their office. I also just wanted to delve into it a little more by, I ran across this recently. This is our newly installed Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, and in a recent interview on CNN State of the Union, basically reaffirmed NOAA's commitment, that he stands by NOAA and our science and is not going to interfere in as long as they stick with the science and the facts, he's comfortable with whatever the outcome. So, we do not have a NOAA administrator at the moment. He is our senior ranking person in the department, and this is what we have to go on. So it looks pretty good, just in terms of reaffirming NOAA as a science institution, and he's comfortable with just let the scientists do the science. Now switching just a little bit, where I wanted to just talk about, since the new administration, again, we do not have any, I think the first two political appointees just showed up last week. They are not, in any levels like the Director of Communications or Ledge Affairs or the Administrator or anybody like that. So we're still operating on a business as usual. So we are continuing to communicate our science and service and stewardship, climate, and otherwise. And just for a few examples here, so, since the end of the year, we've communicated about 2016 global temperature records. Every month we work with NCEI to put out the monthly and global climate highlights. Different line offices are putting stuff out like NOAA research on atmospheric rivers or carbon dioxide levels or climate.gov. I know just recently today just put up their ENSO blog related to the latest ENSO outlook that Weather Service CPC just put out today. And, we're using all of NOAA's social media tools to help let people know, both media and the public, about our science that is coming out. So we are continuing as business as usual, and so should all of you. Before we get into a little bit more about some of the specifics of maybe some best practices for communicating about the science, I wanted to just talk about some of the key climate resources, what I consider kind of the Bibles of what we can safely talk about when it comes to climate. And again, one of the attachments that will come out as part of this when they send out the URL for this webinar is a separate sheet and with all the URL links directly in it, which will be more helpful than you frantically trying to take this down here. So one of the things that I know as a go-to is the USGCRP's climate change impacts in the U.S. So it's a couple years old now. However, it's NOAA is one of the main federal agencies as part of USGCRP, along with NASA, NOAA, Department of Energy, EPA, Department of Interior, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is the federal government's stance on climate change and climate change impacts in the United States. So, this is a great piece of information that you can rely on and use. And if people are asking you for information of how, is climate change impacting my region, it's broken up by region and sector and other things. So in the one-pager that will be part of your attachments, you'll have URLs to the website. There's a link directly to download, so you could get different chapters, or if you want a chapter on the oceans or agriculture or something like that. The key findings of the report, and again, there's 12 key findings, and those are really the basis of what the U.S. government is saying related to climate change in the United States. And yes, the global climate is changing, and it is apparent across the U.S., and in the last 50 years, it has been primarily due to human activities, predominantly from the burning of fossil fuels. So that is one of the main conclusion from the 2014 National Climate Assessment. Just so many of you know, the next version of this is scheduled, I believe, to come out in 2018. Various chapters are now being worked on at this time, and there is a website, www.globalchange.gov/NCA4 that has been set up. I know some of the draft chapters related to the physical aspects of climate change are out for public comment. So, it's pretty consistent with this one from 2014. Other resources just to highlight. So I know I personally work a lot with NCEI on putting out the monthly and global climate highlights each month. So those are good if you're just tracking what trends are and where we're going. Those are great places. Also, NCEI does have some like Climate at a Glance and other tools where if you're looking for information on various sites in terms of trends, they have that information as well. Also, NCI has the BAMs, billion-dollar disasters, and then they also annually put out as a special bulletin of the American Meteorological Society the State of the Climate Report and the extreme events. So the extreme events from the previous year was released in December, and the next State of the Climate Report will probably come out in July or August at the latest. Other things you probably all know, the CPC outlooks, the third Thursday of the month, temperature, precipitation, drought, 1 to 3 months, as well as the hurricane and seasonal outlooks. We do big media rollouts to help support those. Other great resources, the Climate Resilience Toolkit done by OAR's Climate Program Office. Everything from steps to becoming more resilient, case studies, tools, region maps, and the Climate Explorer. So again, this does county-level projections for the U.S. I think the data goes back at least 50 years for past observations, and then uses IPCC projections to do 2 different scenarios for the future. And then climate.gov, again, news and features, maps and data, the climate dashboard there. There's a really good global warming frequently asked questions thing there. And then for many of you that get a lot of questions on ENSO is they do have a really good, and it was our attempt to kind of create a one place for a lot of ENSO related information in a more publicly accessible way is the ENSO page, and then there's an ENSO blog as well. And then finally, for other, climate change is a very broad topic. Every line office in NOAA is involved in some capacity. So, NOS has great stuff on sea level projections, digital coast for how do you visualize how sea level rise will impact some of our coastal areas, or nuisance flooding projections for that. Fisheries has done a lot work and recently on regional vulnerability assessments for commercially and recreational important fish species and shellfish. And, OAR does a ton of things, everything from ocean acidification to greenhouse gases to climate models and things like that. Again, there will be a kind of a resource cheat sheet that will be sent out, so you can kind of pause through some of that. Now I'm just gonna briefly just introduce the kind of NOAA communications a bit, and then just really initially go into some of the best practices. Again, there are public affairs folks within the Weather Service, Susan Buchanan and Maureen O'Leary, who can provide a more in-depth communications training if needed. And if some of you are from different other line offices, we do have staff in other line offices as well. I know many of you may have worked with Monica Allen and Kelly Pirtle or Teo Stein in OAR similarly. So again, the role of NOAA Communications is really, we're supporting you communicating about your own science, service, and stewardship, and we're here to help as much as we can. Some ways that we can help, basically just providing counsel on strategic communications, how to get more bang for your buck, what different aspects of communication, audience, who are you really trying to communicate this to, what are the best ways to reach them. We do help writing news releases or featured web stories on Noahgov or some of the line office websites, or work very closely with the different line offices and their comms departments and kind of back and forth, as well as social media content. We can help set up press conferences, create media opportunities. We can help vet media inquiries. Often we're the first line when we get calls from reporters and then have to call around to figure out who's the best person to answer that. We can help you participate in interviews and support your efforts to speak to the press. Provide media training and prepare for interviews, help you prepare key messages and research some of the background information, be a sounding board, and help you understand bigger picture context of maybe where some of the reporters are going from. Help to coordinate amongst the different line offices, so if it's an issue that transcends more than one line offices, they know what's coming up, and provide additional information and follow up with the reporter. Just in a nutshell, I just wanted to include this. This is one of our latest org charts for NOAA's Office of Communications. And again, for the most part, as you can see, we're people out in the field sites. So for Weather Service, again, Susan Buchanan is leading that shop at the moment with Maureen O'Leary. There's 2 people in headquarters right now. We also have Dennis Felgren out at the National Hurricane Center in Miami, and there's several vacancies that you can see. There's a lot of vacancies in our program at the moment. Many of you may have worked with Chris Vaccaro. He's currently our acting director right now, as our director is out on a medical thing for a few weeks. And we do, the actual director of communications is a political appointee, and we do not have one yet. And again, so I work in headquarters on media relations, mainly focused on a lot of our climate stuff, since it transcends a lot of the different line offices. So your first stop within the Weather Service, if you are looking for assistance related to media, is Susan and Maureen in Weather Service, and then they work directly with your Weather Service Office of Communications as well, depending on the issue. So now I'm going to just briefly go over a few best practices. And again, this is not an in-depth 101 on, preparing yourself for media, but I just wanted, while we had some time together, just to keep things in mind, because I know many of you do field media questions, and they're good things to keep in mind, whether it's a constituent or media. Number one, I know people like to say, oh, this is off the record. Well, the reality is, assume there is no off record. Everything you say can and will be used in a news article of some format. I mean, I've even seen some of our folks where reporters are actually, interviewing some of our people for maybe a more in-depth news article, and they'll take out a tweet with an image and, attribute it to them and tweet it out to, tens of thousands of people even before they finish the article. So in this era of, just look around, it doesn't take that much. In this era, everything you say can and likely will be used or said in some news capacity, and that goes for print media, television, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you name it. Number two, just know your audience and their specific needs. And again, whether you're talking with a constituent or media, there are media have their own different audiences. If you're a Fox News reporter, your audience that you're targeting is different than, say, CNN or CNBC or, BBC America or whoever. Or if you're a blogger, that's different. But just try and know who you're talking with and what are they trying to go at. Again, come prepared with a few simple and memorable talking points or key facts, and then, be prepared to support them with actual data or facts or anecdotes or something like that. And then, unlike a published paper where you're kind of leading up towards your conclusion, news is kind of a reverse pyramid where you start with your headline and then work back to, information that helps support that. But, when you try and develop three very simple key messages, always start with, if you wanted one thing to come out of that interview or one quote, what would that be? And start with that. And don't be afraid to repeat it several times throughout your whole talking with people. Again, keep your answers short. Where people get into trouble is they blab on, and and like I said, things can and will be used or taken out of context. Use metaphors and imagery and links to current events. One of my favorite metaphors currently in the climate community that our own Deke Arndt at NCEI, when talking about long-term climate trends and global warming on top of shorter-term variability, such as an El Nino or a La Nina, where he describes it as being on an escalator, where if you're on the escalator, that's like the long-term pattern of climate change. It's slowly warming. And on that, if you jumped up, that might be a La Nina kind of boost in temperature. And if you kind of squatted down, that might be, the warmer one might be an El Nino. And then if you squatted down, that might be a La Nina, or whatever kind of shorter-term variability you're talking about. So just as an example, that's a metaphor. People get it. Everybody pretty much has been on an escalator, and they can visualize that. They can't always visualize, a 0.03 degree increase in temperature over 15 years. It doesn't compute to them. When possible, use concrete details and not too abstract. Again, like the case of, sea level rise or something where we're talking about millimeters of change over years. People, they can't, it's almost too abstract. But if you talk about, okay, sunny weather, recurrent flooding. People, if you live in Miami, you get it when you saw at the last, full moon, it was flooding in the streets near the coast, or, some example like that. Again, repeat your key messages. You should, social science has shown people can't really remember more than about 3 main messages, and just repeat them, because the more you say it, the more it'll stick. Let your passion show. You guys are the experts. I've seen some phenomenal interviews by our scientists and our meteorologists throughout NOAA, and let your passion show and be honest, and just don't spin it, but just be yourself, and that passion will show. And also, just as it relates to interviews, and that includes whether you're being contacted by one of us in public affairs or by a reporter, you do not have to do an interview. If you don't feel comfortable, if it's not in your area of expertise, or you have like 10 minutes and you have to go pick up your child and you don't have time to do it, you can always say no. I mean, it's always good to give reporters, I'm not the right person, however, so-and-so at the Western Regional Climate Center, or so-and-so, the state climatologist, might be a better. It's always good to at least give them another lead, rather than just going, I'm not going to do it, or something. A couple of best practices related to suggestions of don'ts. Again, in NOAA, we are a science agency, chocker full of acronyms, and and depending on your area of NOAA, they're totally different acronyms. So really try and avoid using acronyms and technical jargon as much as possible. Use plain English. Many of the science reporters are not technically literate or scientifically literate. Many of them maybe hadn't even had a class in science, and so if we're talking in acronyms and jargon, it won't translate into their story. So just try and boil it down to, like you were talking with, your grandmother or your child or something like that. Don't let tough questions stump you. Bridge to your key messages. So, if you're asked, well, so-and-so did this, or, a bridge is something like, well, the important thing to remember is this, or as I said before, this, or if I could only say one thing about, this storm, it would be this. And again, in the list of materials that will come out afterwards, I've also included something that our OAR colleagues did, and it's called Top 10 Interview Pitfalls. And so it has just 10 questions of things that can kind of take you down into a wormhole, and just suggestions to help you kind of get out of it. And then on the other pages are successful bridging phrases. So this is just, you want to pivot out of a question that you don't want to answer, or you're not the expert. I'm not the expert on this, but what I can tell you is this. And, you should never really answer something if you're not the expert, because then you're either speculating or getting on the hypothetical. And again, that can lead into trouble, just in terms of saying something that you really didn't intend to say. And again, avoid just saying no comment. That almost means like something, but you're just refusing to say it. Just say, I'm not an expert in that field, so I'm not, I can't really speak to that. But what I can tell you is this. And then, sometimes it's always good to avoid commenting on other people's forecasts or conclusions unless you're really one of the experts. And this happens a lot, particularly when it comes to global temperature models or change or something like that, where, we're asked, so-and-so came up with this graph, what is your comment on it? And so often either you haven't had time to read it, or it's not even published in a journal, so it's, it's kind of somebody trying to take you down a wormhole where you don't want to go. So, it's best not to just comment it at all. So that, in a nutshell, is, and I wanted to leave time open for as many questions as possible, but what I wanted to do before I do that is just review some of the other materials that will be included as well as this webinar when it's or link to the actual full webinar. So one of them, again, is a kind of packet related to Departmental Administrative Order 219-1, Public Communications. And again, that is the actual administrative order and the guidance for NOAA employees regarding the implementation of that public communications order. The second one is a packet related to the NOAA Administrative Order 202-735D, the scientific integrity. And again, that does include the entire administrative order, a procedural handbook for NOAA employees of how to implement this, the scientific integrity. And then I also included a framework for internal review and approval of fundamental research communications. Again, that kind of goes outside the scope of communications to media, but if you have any curiosities, it basically tells you to work through your immediate supervisor in your line office for those. Other things that I mentioned that will be included are, there's a few pages called NOAA Climate Resources, and again, these are the links to things like the more useful pages of the National Climate Assessment, some of the NCAI products, some of the CPC products, the NOAA's Arctic Report Card, some of the explaining extreme events from a climate perspective, the press release and BAM's report that we put out, that the $1 billion disasters, links to the Climate Resilience Toolkit or climate.gov, including some of their things like the ENSO blog, Drought Monitor, drought.gov, some of the sea level rise products in NOS, and the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report, as well as I clipped out some of the key findings basically from the 2014 National Climate Assessment. And then the final one is the top, again, just the top 10 interview pitfalls, just where it talks how to avoid kind of going down different wormholes with the media and or, a stakeholder as well, and how you can help prepare yourself to avoid going down those holes. And I'm also going to reverse just for a second and give the plug to, I'm assuming most of the people on this call are from the Weather Service. So again, Susan Buchanan and Maureen O'Leary, we all work in the same office, but they should be, if you have any interest in further, whether it's media training or help with a particular issue. I know many of you have probably heard from them. They field a lot of media calls every single day related to every kind of weather event, that happens or could happen. And they're a great resource to bounce stuff off. And, as well as I'm a resource as well as anybody on our team. So with that, here's my contact information. I'm easily locatable in the NOAA locator. And I'll open it up to questions.
All right, great. Thanks, Brady. A quick reminder to everyone that you can ask questions through the questions pane of the GoToWebinar control panel. So I'll be monitoring that over the next few minutes as they start to come in. So again, thank you, Brady. I know a lot of people in the weather offices, some people even shy away from even touching on the climate change subject. So I'm sure this will be a great resource to pass along. Kind of while we're waiting for questions to come in, do you have any tips for trying to get more people in the office on board with talking about it? Because like I said, I know a lot of people in the offices don't even want to touch it. Do you have anything to speak on that?
Well, I think one of our most common questions we get from media is, particularly when we roll out our U.S. climate highlights report, is various local media or regional media will call, or whether, let's say there was a heat wave, and then, we'll get calls. I'd like to talk to somebody in NOAA as to how unusual this was, or does this mean there's climate change? And so, I think our weather forecast office and our climate folks in the Weather Service are uniquely qualified to answer some of these questions. I mean, certainly when you have a heat wave or a cold snap or a precipitation event, I think you have the ability to put that event in the context of what is normal or not and what is history showed. I think, when you are getting things like a heat wave, you're not in the position, reporters want you to attribute it immediately to things like climate change. And I think what we've seen from, that BAM's report of explaining extreme events from a climate perspective is the science of attribution. It is a new science. It is evolving. It is evolving very quickly. But, as the event is happening and even immediately afterwards, we will not have done the true science to conclusively state whether or not, climate change, it probably hasn't caused it, but, certainly all these events are happening in a rapidly changing world. And so, kind of thinking of the analogy that Deke uses, when we do get heat waves or things like that, we are in this pattern of longer term climate change. And within that, we do have weather variability. So both are kind of happening, but it takes more in-depth science to kind of figure those out as to, was one more of a dominant cause than the other. I mean, they're both happening, but how exactly one more than not. But I think when it comes to an individual weather service office, that immediate, if you had an 80-degree day in February in Chicago, is that within the range of normalcy? And I would assume you guys have access to your own climate data records that you can do that, or if not, then it's archived in the NCEI one. And I guess, one of the other ones is using the local climate analysis tool, the LCAT, and in combination with some of the tools that NCEI has to help field and answer some of those questions. Because inevitably, whenever an unusual weather phenomenon happens, a heavy precipitation event, a storm, a blizzard, a heat wave, a cold snap, we get calls as to, can I talk to somebody about what this means, or is it normal or usual, or when was the last time it happened? And I guess I would actually like to hear from the Weather Service, some of the forecast offices as to how comfortable they are feeding, kind of answering those type of questions, or, and how they deal with some of the climate question, how is this linked or not linked to climate change type, how do they deal with that?
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I know it's a challenge for most of the, climate focal points in the office, and especially since other staff members in the office aren't as on board. So it definitely is a challenge, and I think this is going to, these resources are going to be a great help for that. So we did get another question. When we do post climate change related things on social media, there inevitably are commenters who say things like, stick to the weather, quit getting political, I'm unfollowing you, and so on. It's enough to often deter people from posting anything related to climate, carbon dioxide, ice melting, and such. There's a balance between addressing citizen concerns and feeding the trolls. How would you recommend we respond to comments like these?
I think the really nasty ones you ignore. I mean, there's no way you cannot engage in intelligent discussions with nasty personal comments. I mean, those are the trolls that are out there. I mean, we get a ton of those even within NOAA. But I think it's really sticking to the facts and trying to really stick to the science of, if you're putting out facts of, okay, this was the warmest, event we've ever experienced, or, this ranks as, even some of the NCI climate stuff, this ranks as the third warmest. I mean, I think we just have to put out the facts, and, if there's an erroneous, misinformation that could be corrected, I would say feel free to do that. But often, unfortunately, just the way climate is, you get a lot of really, it's such a politicized issue that it's very difficult to kind of get out of that loop. And as you've seen from the comments, two people will get into it and they end up personally insulting each other, and then most of the other people probably tune out. I think NOAA has to stick to the high road and stick to our science and stick to our facts. And, we should not shy away from putting out, our observations, what the conclusions of our observations and our science does and says.
Great, thanks. So we don't have any other questions right now, so a quick reminder, if you have any, to please type them in the questions pane right now, and we'll try to address them before we sign off here. While we're waiting, Brady, did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, so I guess the other one is, NOAA.gov. So I'll just say a couple things about some of the NOAA tools. So if you go to NOAA.gov, so those are the real estate managed by our office, and then as well as the NOAA, the main NOAA Facebook page, the main NOAA Twitter feed, and Instagram. And I mean, I just wanted to give you an example for some of our reach. Hang on, I'm just looking for my one page of notes. So, for example, just in the month of March, so the NOAA.gov, so we did have like 5.4 million page views on NOAA.gov, and most of those people are looking for weather and, kind of go in there and want a weather forecast or a weather product. So the weather services, we're kind of a welcome mat to NOAA, and many people, are looking for weather, so they come to us and, get redirected into the weather service for a forecast or something. But also when it comes to Facebook, we have over 500,000 people on Facebook, over 825,000 Twitter followers, and over 360,000 Instagram followers. So we do have a great impact, and I know the Weather Service also has a huge impact. And I mean, when it comes to social media, there is a weekly call amongst a social media team, including at least one from each line office. And so we do coordinate a lot. And when it does come, so I just want to say, when you have some of these good stories about what NOAA has done or responded to different weather events or other things like that, or just reporting on climate, we do have an ability to really help get and augment the message and get it out there. And we do work very closely with the line office communications offices too. So like in the Weather Service, it's Greg Romano's shop, working with Susan and Maureen, and I know I work a lot with some of the CPC people and doing monthly climate calls. That's another one that I did want to mention is, so including this coming up on April 20th, so every month it is geared more for media, but it is open for NOAA people to listen in on, where we do have monthly climate calls. We have somebody from NCEI talking about the previous month's global and U.S. climate highlights. We'll have somebody from CPC talking about the 1 and 3 month temperature, precipitation, and drought outlooks, as well as where we are at the El Nino or La Nina, the ENSO outlook. And we'll have a guest, somebody talking about a weather or climate event, and we'd like to have somebody more talking about kind of impacts. So I know this coming month, we're having somebody from the Southeast Regional Climate Center talking about the frost, the really Arctic plunge later in March, and kind of what that did to a lot of the agricultural crops in the Southeast. So we do, other than the months where Weather Service is rolling out, like a hurricane outlook or the winter or spring outlook, we do have those monthly climate calls. So, if you have, so it's a good opportunity to listen in, or if you have local media that are interested, direct them there. And then, and I do keep a media list. So if you have local media that are really interested in this, I can add them onto our media list, and they'll get the kind of media advisory every month, and both, the reports when they're put out.
All right, wonderful. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. So with that, we will be concluding our presentation. So thank you everyone for attending and participating. Give us a couple days and we'll have the materials from today's seminar, including the recording, posted online. and as well as the handouts that Brady was referring to throughout the presentation. So thank you again for your participation, and thank you again, Brady, for presenting for us. And this concludes our webinar for today.
Thanks.